interested in that in my family.
Yes, indeed. Well, speaking of films, 2 weeks ago at the Hall of Christ, we showed a movie which was a movie of a speech given at Chautauqua Institution in August of 1936. And you were intimately involved in that whole process. First of all, tell me about your dad and his role in that whole episode where Franklin Roosevelt came here.
Well, I think that I don't really know when the first time that Roosevelt came to Chautauqua. We know that that was back when he was Assistant Secretary, I believe it is, of the Navy. And I always heard about that after he became governor and then became that man in the White House. And and of course, we had always at Chautauqua, my father always had his eyes out for what was going to be the most prevailing interest of that time. We had a wonderful period, you know, of exploration. And when Lindbergh flew over the grounds and dropped a note, and Amelia Earhart landed her own plane, and Commander Byrd came, and so on. So it got to be, then this particular thing was the political. And my father, at some point, which I don't know, extracted a promise from Roosevelt that he would come. And I well remember when Mrs. Roosevelt made several visits to Chautauqua, and I I don't remember when he came as a Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but I do remember when he came as governor, and we'd had governors before, and it was always very important to Chautauqua, because I think of those original days when Theodore Roosevelt came in 1905, and so my father had a concept of the people, I think, that were making history, and hoped very much whenever he could to get them to Chautauqua.
By the way, the room we are speaking in is the Ulysses S. Grant room, and in 1875 Ulysses Grant found his way to Chautauqua, and he stopped here before he went to Chautauqua. A little bit of history here.
Yes, it is, and of course that was quite exciting, because that was the most people that had ever come anywhere near a 2-week camp meeting. They came in boats and carriages and everything, apparently, to see General Grant.
So the day arrives. Tell me about what's going on in your household. Your father's the president of Chautauqua Institution. You're a 26-year-old home for this exciting. Tell me a little bit about what's going on in the household.
Well, it was pretty exciting, because we heard nothing like, I guess, the way they have the protection nowadays. We thought it was pretty extensive, because I remember hearing the rumor that there was somebody posted under every culvert between Mayville, where his train was to come, and where he would arrive at Chautauqua. And that seemed pretty extravagant. And we had about, I don't know, a couple of days ahead of time, someone came and inspected the house, went all over. And it's just a cottage. It's not a beautiful house like this one. And so it didn't take them long to go through it. Then we got a list of the people that were coming, and the approved list of people who would come down after the amphitheater speech. But then food was prepared for a little reception afterwards. And my parents were always very thoughtful of what was meaningful to other people, I think. And my mother said, we're not going to have the women who are working in the kitchen miss hearing and seeing their president, so we're just going to lock the house and go up to the amphitheater, and they're to go with us. And so they asked me to sit very near the back of the amphitheater so that I could get out very quickly and run home and open the house and unlock the doors and get ready for what was going to happen, so that everybody was out of the house. Well, of course, everybody was out of the house, but there were state troopers at every single window. And it being a hot night, I opened all the windows, and each time I'd open a window, there would be a state trooper. They weren't exactly scared of me, but I was scared enough of them, and felt very safe. And so that was the way preparations were made. Actually, and this seems very funny now, a very rickety balustrade was put in onto the stairway. We knew that he needed help, but my goodness, in a little summer cottage, the stairs were very narrow, and could never have gone upstairs in our house at all. But we always used to call that the Roosevelt banister, because it was put in for that purpose. We had never needed it before. So the house was gotten ready, and all the guests, there was a very big official list of guests that were going to be there, and of course including Bob Jackson, including the governor, and several other people, and then a few Chautauquans of rather official rank were to be there, and everybody was to be there before he arrived. No one would be allowed to just loiter into a social event. That was the setting. You asked me about how we got ready for them. That was it.
So then you're told to sit in the back of the amphitheater. Tell me about what was going on in the amphitheater before President Roosevelt came onto the stage.
Well, it was packed, and in those days it was the custom to invite a lot of important, whoever they considered to be important on the grounds at the time, the heads of the various departments and so on, to sit on the platform, so that when you see the pictures of Roosevelt there, it looks very densely packed all the way back towards the choir loft, and that was what was considered quite an honor, and you could they don't do that now, and since then, you know, various things have changed about it. But the people would be asked to get there and get seated. However, there was two seats vacant, one for Roosevelt and one for the governor, who was delayed. I don't remember the reason why he was delayed in getting there. But anyway, the amphitheater was packed, and of course standing behind all around. Now, we've had that happen on many occasions that I can remember, when Commander Byrd was there, and I think almost any of the political figures, Al Smith was there and so on. But this was more pulsating, it seemed. People really were excited. And not everybody at Chautauqua liked Roosevelt, so there was always wondering if there was, I don't think anybody ever worried about protection, but they worried about rudeness, and of course there wasn't any such thing, because he was the President of the United States. My father talked about the fact that this was one time when he didn't have to think about an introduction, because the only introduction was the President of the United States.
Was there any music, anything that you recall going on to kind of keep crowd control?
Isn't that funny? But I don't remember. But I would not be at all surprised that there was some singing, maybe. But I just don't remember it at all. And I think I just had it on my mind that I had a purpose, that I had to do something proper so my mother didn't have to be harried in getting down there.
So then the time arrives, and does your father get up? Does he then sort of draw the crowd together, and does he do that introduction? Yes,
and in those days, my father's voice was really very suited to the amphitheater. And I don't remember what kind of amplification there would have been in 1936. Nothing like what we have today. But obviously there were a lot of microphones of one kind or another in front, but I have a feeling that they were all for reporters rather than an amplification throughout. But the amphitheater does have excellent acoustics if a person knows how to use their voice. And I think that not only Franklin Roosevelt, but my father, they both knew how to use their voices there. And so I think he would simply have gotten up and said something like, "Good evening," and not expecting a response, and then introduced him. That's why we were all there, and no sense in wasting time. But the Daily may tell you that. I can't remember.
Then you see in the film him sort of walking out, which is a very short piece, but it's a very rare piece of footage.
That's right. Was that his son Elliot on one side of him? I know his son Elliot came and helped him at the time he was here as governor. And I know that James had been to Chautauqua several other times, and after his father died, had spoken here. And I remember seeing him one or two times, and his remembering it. But who it was that brought him, there are steps. I'm sure there are steps from the back of the amphitheater to get onto the platform. And so someone must have had to help him at the back, but nobody in the audience would have been able to see that because of all the people sitting there. And then because I had to leave the minute the speech was over, I didn't get to see how he got off the platform and how he was saved from being seen by people until it was time for him to come down to our house.
As he's working his way to, well, actually gets to the podium, and then all of a sudden you see the salute, the Chautauqua salute.
Now, that might be that my father called for that before the introduction. That's true. It was the custom that the Chautauqua salute was only given if the president called for it, and he would always explain to people ahead of time. So he may very well have done that, but it slipped my mind. And it was originated, way back to signal to a speaker who was deaf and couldn't hear the applause, and it became a very unique and special signal for Chautauquans. And so that may very well have been part of the introduction before the president, and just as he came out, then they would have started it, I think.
What kind of night was it?
Hot.
Hot night?
Oh, it was terribly hot. And of course, we weren't used to, none of us on the platform, I was way back, were used to those, what do they call them, Klieg lights that were so strong. I suppose all political people were used to that, and probably the president had a lot of that streaming down on his face, but we didn't have to use it at Chautauqua, so I'm sure that my father and all those other people that had spoken there didn't have those bright lights. And on top of that, it was a terribly steamy, hot night. So my father never took off his jacket, and none of the people there did, and everybody was very dressed up. So I'm sure lots of people were kind of uncomfortable because they had a little bit more on than they might wear today. But it didn't rain or anything like that, so it was a clear night. And I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, but he was brought down to the house in an open car.
What time of day was the ceremony? Do you recall? Was it
After dinner.
after dinner?
Yeah, I think it was the regular hour, 8:30 or 8:15, whenever we have the amphitheater program. And I don't know just exactly how he got there. I suppose that they brought him right to the amphitheater because there was no dinner ahead of it for him.
During the course of the speech, he, of course, recognizes your father and thanks him profusely for inviting him. And then, as the movie shows, he covers a broad base, but he also talks about the term which everybody remembers the speech,
Yeah.
I hate war. Did that mean much to you at the time when he said that? Was that a conversation immediately after the speech?
Well, I don't think it was. It seems to me that we attached great importance to it afterwards. but that we were listening to the whole speech. And we were used to him talking about our need to understand what was going on in Europe and all these things about Lend-Lease and all that kind of thing. And sometimes people were attributing it to politics and so on. So we were listening, but I do remember very much that it was striking a note for peace. So that as I look back upon it, I don't remember that I would have thought I hate war until maybe even the media, as we didn't call them that in those days, but maybe they picked that up. Was it in the headlines or anything? I don't recall.
I think Professor Barrett said what Roosevelt had hoped to come across was the I choose peace,
right,
as opposed to I hate war. But
I think we heard it pretty much that way, but I think that because of the emphasis on that, we all have to think of it as I hate war. But whether I felt a terrible tingle at the back of my neck or anything at that time, I don't know. But it was a serious time that we were all concerned about.
that speech, if you had to judge the demographics of the audience at the time, would you guess that it was a Democratic audience or a Republican audience, or was it just citizens seeing a president?
Well, I think that a large majority were citizens seeing a president, and but I'm sure that there were a certain number of very astute conservatives who probably sat on their hands. I'm not sure, but I think that there weren't too many avowed Democrats. It wasn't a Democratic region, but we had never been discourteous. I mean, Al Smith was there, and there was a big crowd for him, and there'd been many others. I think everybody assumed that most everyone that actually lived at Chautauqua and voted at Chautauqua was apt to be a Republican. Mm-hmm. But after all, we had a large number of people from all across the country, and when we had Alf Landon, who had been there that same summer, there had been a great outpouring of people for him, but and there was never any. I think that was very courteous group, and delighted. We hadn't had a president since Theodore Roosevelt, so none of the people in between had one come to Chautauqua. So,
were there any standing ovations during the course of that 60-minute speech?
I can't remember if there were or not. You'd have to consult the Daily if they were careful and wrote it up properly.
Anything during that 16-minute speech which you, as a 26-year-old, it jumped out at you?
Was that only 16 minutes long?
It was
I see.
Fairly short speech.
Well, I'm afraid that I had my mind on my job. And being rather a liberal myself at that time, of course, my favorite was Norman Thomas, who was coming later. But I had voted for Norman Thomas the first time, and I think I was prepared to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. But I just think that I would be false to say any particular feelings that I had.
Sure. So the speech is over. Your job is to run back to the house, open up the house, get it ready. The guest list starts arriving one by one, and one of them is
Bob Jackson.
Bob Jackson. We haven't talked about him. Describe him.
Well, I have a hazy notion of what he was like that night, and I'm sure I wasn't sufficiently impressed with his importance that night, but I had had an opportunity to see him on other occasions, and I knew that my father admired him very, very much and was proud of the fact that he had come from here and that he had been, as a young man, coming to Chautauqua at various times, and that he himself had known him, but that I couldn't claim to have. Those were my college years and my teaching. I taught at college at that during those years, and so I wasn't there all the time. But I knew my father thought very highly of him and was delighted to think that of the career that he was achieving, the success in his career that he was achieving.
So all of a sudden, all the guests have arrived because they were supposed to arrive. There would be nobody after the president who would be really permitted. All of a sudden, the car comes up. Do we have any recollections?
Oh, I have a very strong recollection of that, because among my duties was to stand beside the man who was checking the names and to identify them. So that, because after all, he was I think he must have come with the president or been somehow, or with the police people, because I had to say, yes, this is so-and-so and so forth, and they would be entered into the house. And so I was standing on the porch when this car drove up, and I saw them help the president out of the car. Nobody else could see this because everybody was inside the house. No one was on the porch except this man and myself. And they helped him out. And unfortunately, our house sets up.
How did they do that? How did they
They lifted him up by his elbows, one on each side.
Right.
And how he arranged himself. Now that I have trouble getting in and out of a car, I know it must have been very difficult to arrange himself in such a way that people could get under his arms properly. But that's what they did, and he held his elbows like that. And he didn't try to walk until they got him onto our porch. Mm-hmm. There are 2 or 3 steps right by the street. Then there's a brick walk, little slopey, and then about 3 steps onto the porch. Mm-hmm. And then it would be probably 10 feet across to where my mother then stood in the doorway. And it was very interesting to see how John Barrett described his walk, because I wouldn't have been able to describe it or say particularly what it was, but when I saw John showing how he had to use his hips, I recognized it. And so he walked across, but they stayed with him, whoever it was, and the 2 men, and stepped back, and he reached out his hand, and Mother opened the door, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Bester, I do remember what a cool home you have." And of course, everybody was boiling hot, and he must have been boiling, so it was a very wonderful, typical thing for him to say, but you know, he cocks his head back and gives that smile that melted everyone. Right. And so then he was held, and he walked that way across the little expanse, and there was an armchair for him, and he quickly snaps something at his knees and sits. And I don't know how those things work, but he did it himself, and sat, I think, a whole lot more gracefully than I can now. And then he just sat there, and each one of the people that was there was brought up to speak to him, and refreshments were served, and the men were there at the end. He didn't speak again. After all, he'd given his speech. Right. But he always had a word for everyone, and a lot of people, he'd do their names, you know. So he must have had a phenomenal memory for names, although somebody probably was saying them too. And it was a very memorable thing for everybody in the room. Was something very moving about admiring, or maybe not even admiring, this man, but having to admire his courage and his fortitude when in the face of such difficulty.
Did you get his autograph?
No, I don't think so. I was not an autograph seeker, but we were awfully lucky in having a lot of autographs around, because people wrote to my father. So we never asked anybody for them.
Did anybody, I'm just curious, I mean, here you have somebody in your house, and I don't even know what the protocol would be, let alone, do you recall anybody taking a photo?
Well, I think that, I don't remember anyone taking a photo that night inside the house. I shouldn't say that we didn't have autographs. Mother had a guest book, and I've got Eleanor Roosevelt's name in that several times, but I don't think, not the one that I have doesn't show Roosevelt's name. And some other very interesting people are in some of these books. They're in the archives now anyway. But we used to have a photographer who was ever present, and but he liked to pose people, and you had to wait a certain length of time until he was ready to take the picture. And I'm sure he wouldn't have gotten away with that night at our place. And people didn't have instant cameras in those days.
Was there was it a long reception?
No.
No.
And of course, instead of people lining up, there weren't that many people. I would say our room was not the shape of this room that we're in right now, but you know, this is a summer cottage. And because of the fact they did have a fairly large garden outside, but that wouldn't have been feasible anyway, so people weren't outside. So I would be very interested maybe to look it up and find out what it said the next day about about how many people were there. So it wouldn't take long for them, and some of these people knew each other quite well. I'm sure that Bob Jackson talked to the official people, and probably just the few guests that were Chautauquans would probably not have spent any time doing anything except just meeting the president and feeling good to think they had.
So the president then leaves your place and gets back in a car and
heads right back to his train. Yeah, and I don't think my father went with him. He might have. I have no recollection of that. I have a slight recollection of him going out the front door and the process being reversed. And I think that there were a lot of people standing in the street by that time, because they all knew where our house was. But there weren't lights and camera and noise. There wasn't anything of that kind.
After it's over and the folks have left and your mom and dad sort of sit down, what was their reflections on the day?
Well, I have to admit that my mother was not a Roosevelt admirer, and I'm sure they probably talked about it. My father was very careful about his political discussions with people and kept a very open mind. And many people say, oh, well, of course he must have been a Republican too, but I know that he wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool Republican because of the famous story that they told us about. They had their voting place in Chautauqua County, and they would drive back to cast their vote. And one time, some very important matter was happening, and my father was kind of late in being able to get away, and so they drove very hard all day and argued about this particular issue, and they finally got to the St. Elmo, which was kept open in those days, and our cottage was not. And they got ready to go to bed, and were planning. Somebody said, well, will you have breakfast, and then after you vote, will you have lunch before you go? And when they came down in the morning, they said, we're just leaving for New York. There's no sense in our waiting for the polls to open because we're going to cancel each other's vote out. So that gives the lie to the people who were so sure that my father was a Republican, because Mother made no bones about being a good Republican.
Right, right. What an event.
Oh.
Was it, when you saw the movie the last couple weeks ago, did it bring back a moment?
Well, it certainly did. To actually see Roosevelt standing there and see his the words coming out of his mouth, I thought that was very exciting. I can't tell you if I thought that's the way his voice sounded, because we've all heard "I hate war" so many times, and but it was exciting to see it again, because I had I wasn't sitting out in front of him. I didn't see him from the front before, so this was really exciting.
Well, we've been asked to do it again, so I think we'll make that part of the routine on an annual basis.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, this is great. Now, did you...
The Besters were entertaining Franklin and Eleanor. Jackson gave his I hate war speech up there, and I was there for that.
Really?
Yeah, and then I at one visit when he stayed, and I'm not sure it's the same visit, but I think it is. He stayed at the Bester house up there, and he had to ride wherever he went.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Bob Jackson had an open Model A Ford, and as I recollect, it was a four-door Model A Ford. I mean, it had 2 seats,
Okay.
convertible,
Right.
and the top was down. And my recollection is that the party rode in there, and I think Jackson rode in that Model A Ford with Franklin, but I don't remember Eleanor but Jimmy Roosevelt was the one that helped Franklin in and out of his wheelchair, and to get up to the podium.
Mm-hmm. Speaking with.
Marcia Miller.
And Marcia, where do you live?
Well, I live in Buffalo, but at Chautauqua I live at 30 Forest Lane.
Are you a lifer?
Oh, yes.
What brought you to Chautauqua originally?
My aunt, 2 aunts, owned the cottage there, and they bought it in 1929, and I started coming when I was a little girl with my mother.
Are you part of the Lewis Miller?
No, no relation.
Mm-mm. Well, going right to August of 1936, we showed the movie today of Franklin Roosevelt's speech at Chautauqua Institution, and you have a specific memory of that day.
Well, I was very young, 5 years old, and I just remember being taken down to the amphitheater to see the president arrive in his car, and that's what impressed me most, was the automobile with the flag, the American flag on the front, and a couple of Secret Service men on the running boards, and that's about all I remember, really.
Do you remember much about the car, the size of the car? Was it?
Oh, it was big. Yes, it was. I would say they would call it a touring car, and it was a large, dark color.
Was it open air, or was it convertible, or was it a? Remember?
I think it was open air, completely open. I may have confused it with the picture that I have of Franklin Roosevelt when he was governor in that car, which was open.
Right.
I wasn't there at that time, but I do have a picture of it. And I have a picture of Franklin Roosevelt on the stage at the amphitheater giving the speech.
Do you have any recollection as to whether you went into the amphitheater at all?
I don't have any recollection of that, no.
How about the crowd?
Oh yes, I remember a lot of people.
Did your mom and dad take you there? Were they holding your hand while you were watching it?
Well, I'm
by
sure
yourself?
somebody was, and it was probably my mother and an aunt. I don't know what day of the week that would have been.
A weekday.
What a weekday, yes, so probably none of the men would have been there. My father or my uncle would not have been there.
Was there any kind of buzz on the grounds afterwards or before or as you were waiting in line?
Don't remember, no.
How old are you, Rachel?
88.
88 years old. And on August 14th, 1934, you were sitting in the auditorium at Chautauqua Amphitheater.
In the choir loft, right over the entrance from the back of the amphitheater. You know, at that time, the entrance was right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Now they come from either side. but they came out of a step or two up from the back, right in the middle. And I was on the arm of the wall, leaning over his head as he came through that opening with on his son's arm.
Why were you there? Who took you there?
Oh, I took myself there.
So how old were you at the time?
Well, from 14 to 36 is what? I don't want to say it
You were
wrong.
22 years
I
old?
told somebody I couldn't believe I was that old.
And what did you? Was there much publicity to get you
Oh,
from
no. Just the regular daily came out the next day and with his speech and so forth, and the president. But I just remember us walking out on the arm of his son. And then after he had taken 2 or 3 steps on the platform, he let go of the son and walked by himself to the podium right in front of him. And you never would have known he was having too much trouble.
What was your impression of him as far as you saw him there, saw him for the first time? Did you get a sense of that he was the president? Is that the fact that he looked like what you'd seen in the pictures?
Oh yes, exactly.
What kind of crowd was there?
Oh, it was full. The amp was full.
Do you know, was there any pre-program before the president came out? Do you recall? Was there singing?
Dear. Well, no, we were just sitting there waiting for him to speak. I don't recall anything. There might have been. I don't know.
I think I heard just a little bit of hail to the chief as he was coming out. There was.
Oh, I'm sure they might have had something like that.
What was your impression after the speech was over? Did your friends talk about what they just saw?
No, I was alone and I hurried out. But people did enjoy it.
What did you think today, having seen this for the first time in many years?
Well, it was very, very interesting, and I'm glad I got here to see it again because I heard things I didn't hear yesterday. And I'm just glad that you're doing all this because I think it's so worthwhile for everybody to think about what he was saying and seeing how much he meant it.
First of all, who are you?
I'm Jim Snyder.
And you from where?
I'm originally from the Pittsburgh area and now Florida.
What was the occasion? Why were you even at Chautauqua? Were you a summer resident?
My family bought a house when my mother was carrying me, and I spent my first year here in 1923.
Oh my gosh. So when you got word, or your family got word that President Roosevelt would be coming, how did you know about it? Was it through the Daily?
Probably so, yes. And we were here for the summer, and I was 13 years old at the time. So that I was going to the boys' club, and it was our regular activity for the summer.
Right.
We were here from June until Labor Day.
Were your parents Republican or Democrat?
I think most of my family was Republican, but during the Roosevelt administration, one of my uncles was heavily Democratic.
Okay. So, did your mom and dad then say, gee, you're going to see this? Or did
No, nobody said anything. Everybody was pretty free in those days. Now, I would say they asked earlier about Chautauqua and how the politics were, and I would have to say that it was about 2/3 Republican at that time, in the mid-30s. Now I think it's about 2/3 Democrat.
August 14th, 1936, you're in the crowd. Where are you sitting?
No seat. The place was jammed. I was standing.
Do you recall?
I was 13.
Do you recall whether there was any pre-program at all? Was there any music or anything to sort of keep the crowd
I
active?
can't recall that.
So the president comes on stage. What's your impression? You're seeing the president?
Well, of course, he was pretty well crippled, and he hobbled up to the podium and started his speech. But you would certainly know that he was not able to get around very well, even though he didn't like to have people helping him.
As you were watching this today, what memories came back?
Well, I can't say that I have any particular ones, except that the speech was "I hate war," and then of course the Republicans added, "And Eleanor hates war, and Fowler hates war."
When it ended, was there a conversation on the grounds after the president? It was a short speech, and he was there for a short period of time.
Yes.
Was there a lot of afterglow?
At my age, I wasn't a whole lot interested in politics. The rest of the older people probably discussed it a lot.
Right, right. You didn't hear anything from your parents talking about it at all?
No, I know what they were thinking, and they certainly weren't in favor. I think his "I hate war" was certainly a good political move, since he was running for election that year, re-election.
Did you go to any of the other speeches that year? Apparently, Mary Frances saying all four of them.
Landon, and it might be interesting to know that two other things that are high points in my life at Chautauqua was Sousa. I passed him about 2 or 3 feet, or maybe 3 feet on the brick walk right behind the amphitheater. He was very tall, but he was very short. I was only 8 years old, and he wasn't a whole lot taller.
Yeah.
And then the first wedding in the Hall of Philosophy, which I was the janitor of when I was in high school. I got the big salary of $12.75 a week and a gate ticket.
Well, that's very valuable.
And Mary Frances Bester Cram it was her wedding to a captain in the Army.
No kidding.
And that was in the early 40s. It had to be about 42, because the war, I think, was already on. And that was the last year that I had the job, because I was in it the next year.
Sure. Did you hear the story that that gentleman was saying about the comedians talking about Roosevelt saying, "I hate war," and here they're in the middle of the war?
Oh yeah, and everybody talked about it all the time, and of course a lot of people in the service, and I voted during the war too. That was my first election.
How did you vote?
I voted for Republican.
You did hate war. Oh, that's terrific. Any other memories that you, as you saw the film today, that evoked?
No, there was such a big crowd that you really didn't notice any particular thing. And as I guess you brought out the fact that the amphitheater has been very much changed since those days. They didn't have the posts in the choir area. They didn't have the posts in the back of the amphitheater, and they had at least 3 more rows where they now have the storage area.
Terrific. Hey, this is great. I love this. Obviously, there's an interest. Sir, who are you?
My name is Norman Jacobs, and I'm like Jim was an old Chautauquan going way back.
Now, where are you from originally?
From the Pittsburgh area, a place called Trona Heights.
So you're a boys club guy too, and
I went to kindergarten, Boys and Girls Club, high school club, college club, worked here a whole bit.
so August 14th, 1936 rolls around. Do you come on your own, or does your parents bring you?
No, we had a family cottage, and a block and a half from the amphitheater, so we knew always what was going on down there. But I was just 9 years old at the time, and at that age I just managed to get away from going to the amp with my parents and all, and you roamed the perimeter, and we rode bicycles and all that sort of thing. So I didn't sit and listen. I was roaming the outside perimeters. And That was always a banner year, though, because that was the year that Alf Landon also came. So we had both of the presidents, or both of the presidential candidates there.
As you saw the movie today, and obviously saw some visual effects that you probably had maybe never seen. Any emotions that evoked there, as far as size of crowd, reaction of crowd?
No, in my memory, they were just big crowds, and nothing to compare them with. But for the family and for the institution, they were big events when you get a president to come and be on your platform. That was a great thing.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
What else did a kid of 9 years old do at Chautauqua?
My grandfather was Sam Hazlett, and he was active at that time, and we think he was on the stage, so I was looking at the pictures, I'd rather see the small one you talked about, maybe with the resolution sometime.
I think what you need to do, buy the book. This is a plug for the book, and within the book are at least 3 photos of the day, and one of them is sort of a stage shot. So starting with that, you'd say, all right, here he is, and then at some point when you show the movie again, maybe next year, you'll say, there he is, it's live. Now, your grandfather was very much involved at Chautauqua.
Yes.
What was his role?
Well, he was involved with the Chautauqua Reorganization Corporation, and they started in '32 to redeem the bond issue that had been outstanding. So he was involved in the financial push from '32 through '36. And then later, I think 46 to about 56 when he died, he was president of the institution.
Has anybody sat down and gotten your story with relation to your grandfather and Chautauqua?
No, but should have really had my mother, who's gone.
Right.
Now my sister's gone, so there isn't too much available.
Do you have archives of your grandfather's time at Chautauqua?
Not of my own personal ones, no. A few items here and there.
Right.
Yeah.
I think,
That's all.
I'm going to have a plug for John Schmitz. If he were here, he'd be saying, I need to talk to you. I'd at least get a copy, because I'm a very big fan at some point. That's
Have the record.
just have the record of it all.
Yeah.
So I'll plug for him, even though that's...
Yeah, I'll talk to him sometime.
This has been terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
My wife can give you that verse, as she remembers the full verse about it. Good.
I was going to describe.
Okay, so you had a chance to talk to your husband's mother about her reaction to Chautauqua Institution on August 14th, 1936.
Right. I have a feeling that she was on the stage. If she wasn't, I mean, she was the daughter of the Hazletts, and if she wasn't there, she heard from her parents, but she said that they held back the crowd until the gates were open finally, and the people actually came down over the pews. She said it was just like a wave of people coming toward them on the stage. And rather than wait to go down the aisles, they just over the seats. So that's my mother-in-law's memory, and not mine. And the other thing I was going to tell Mr. Schmitz, I think I did tell him, was that during the war, people said, I hate war, Eleanor hates war, Fowler hates war, the people hate war, and then people would say, well, no, what the hell are we fighting for? But it was definitely a joke. But that's my story.
It's a wonderful story.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
How I happened to be at Chautauqua that day was the fact that I was a Boy Scout and Troop 5 from the First Baptist Church on 5th Street. And although I didn't belong to that church, but they had a good scout troop there, so I belonged there. We had a good recreation program and everything.
We'll stop you just for 1 second.
Okay.
So here you were with the Boy Scouts.
Right. And we were, just a handful of us were taken up to Chautauqua that day. And our job was to take people from the main entrance to Chautauqua down to the amphitheater, which we did a few times. And then I happened to remember that I went over to looking at the amphitheater stage. I went over to the right side of the property. And this is where Roosevelt came in the sedan. And as he got out of the car, and of course he had braces, lock braces, and went from there into the amphitheater.
So what was the path again? I'm trying to visualize it. So the amphitheater, I'm looking at the front of the amphitheater.
Mm-hmm.
How would he come in?
Well, as you're looking at the stage, it's the right side,
Okay,
over to the right.
right.
And
The car would come up, and then there was...
it pulled in, and of course, the thing that always stood out in my mind, and I told a number of people, was the fact that the state police, they, to me, looked like 8 or 9 foot tall, big men. And of course, their job was to make security there and to keep us people back, which they did, you know. And the next thing, of course, he started to make a speech. Roosevelt started to make a speech, and as I remember, as he was going in to the amphitheater, they had this handkerchief waving, all white, and looked like thousands to me, but I don't know just how many there were, how 4,000 or 5,000 or whatever. They held it, but it was to a packed house anyway. And then he went on to make a speech, and then after that, I can't remember anything at all that really stands out, unless you have a question for me.
I do. How old were you?
14.
14. And so your Boy Scout troop was selected. Were there a lot of other Boy Scout troops that had been?
No. There was just a handful of us that I remember out of Troop 5, First Baptist Church.
And you had your uniform on?
Oh, yes.
And your role was literally to walk, escort people down?
Down to the path, down to the amphitheater, because, well, people were coming from all over back then.
And when did you? When was the speech? Was it an evening speech?
No, it was in the afternoon.
Afternoon, was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
It was in the afternoon. The time value, I couldn't tell you the time value. No, it was daytime. I don't know what the time was, but it was at daytime.
Did you happen to be up there at the gate when the car came through? You remember that?
No, I was not at the main gate. No, I was down at the amphitheater, and I went over to that area. I think somebody had said something to me about he was going to come into that area in a sedan and with an escort, and so I walked over in that area when the sedan pulled in.
Describe the car. Do you remember?
No, big sedan.
Do you know who was in the car with the president?
Excuse me. No, I don't. All I remember seeing is Roosevelt, President Roosevelt.
What was your feeling when you saw him?
Well, being 14 years of age, I'd feel much greater about it than I did then, you know. But it was still history. It is today.